When we looked in at last time when we were talking about Rome, I talked to you about the origins, the people, going from the Etruscans into what we now think of as Rome. We saw a little clip of ancient Rome, and of course you were going, it wasn't a little clip because you stopped it all the time and kept talking. That's what I'm supposed to do, enhance your education. The different views about Rome, we always think of as, we always think of Roman Empire. And as I made the point last time, Rome as an empire really did not start until late in the 1st century BC. 27 BC is when Augustus is named emperor. That's the first time you have the empire, if you will. It stays as an empire for a while under the Roman aspects until about the middle of the 5th century, in the 400s. Because of internal squabbling, disputes that took place, because of other aspects that were going on, Rome eventually fell. The barbarians were no longer being controlled by the military on the outskirts. The military had been pulled back into Rome to handle some of the skirmishes there. There had been uprisings of different sorts. And so the barbarians, as the Romans called them, did not mean that they were, barbarians per se, but they were not Romans, so they had to be barbaric. They were allowed or able to come into and sack Rome. They literally took over Rome, but they didn't stay long. They were driven out by the military. But Rome was in somewhat of a shambles. The empire had earlier split in another situation. They'd already split in different ways. When Christianity comes in, we'll talk more about that next chapter, next week. The kingdom starts splitting. You already had the extension, and again we saw on the map, if you go back through that little video, it shows you a map, and also in your textbook it has a map of the Roman Empire set up for you on page 84. It shows you just how extensive it is. They had to control all of that. Well, you had to put people in places, and eventually power centers started shifting, and some of it started shifting more to the east. The Asia Minor, the places that we think of as Asia Minor. You'll see Constantinople on that map is built by Constantine, named after himself, and he sort of uses that as his capital. But Rome is the capital. Remember, they're all Romans. Everywhere you go, no matter what it is, you identify yourself as Romans. Very different from the Greeks. The Greeks named themselves after city-states. They were not a unified Greek, per se. The term Greek doesn't come along until later, actually, to apply to people who were of different speaking languages. Hence, for Romans who spoke Latin, wrote Latin, if they encountered people whose language they didn't understand, that's where the expression, it's all Greek to me, comes from. Because they did not know Greek, so they didn't understand Greek. So any language they didn't understand eventually got labeled as Greek. And so that's when we start getting that expression. But the people we think of as Greek actually call themselves Spartans or Athenians or Mycenaeans. They identify themselves from their city-states. Rome was different. Whether you were in the city of Rome or you were someplace else, you were Roman or not Roman. And if you were Roman, you were entitled to all of the privileges that a Roman citizen had. So it's a little different in that way. Rome was expansive, and as I said, they started splitting. In fact, at one time, you have Constantine leading from Constantinople, and the individuals in Rome, the Senate was still in Rome. They were still meeting there. So communication between the two took a while. Constantine eventually wanted to pull all the Senate decisions to be made there in Constantinople. Well, the Senators, as they were called, they didn't want to leave. That's where they were from. They were Romans. They were going to stay there. So you start having schisms, little cracks, if you will. And that's why it was easy for the barbarians to come in, people they call barbarians. What we do know, and we mentioned about the origin stories and how Romulus and Remus story shows us there was some sort of people who probably came from someplace more indigenously oriented. And then we have the Aeneid, the story of Aeneas, sailing from the Near East over. So we know that some of the people who became Romans probably came from that area, and the two cultures eventually melded, not getting rid of either story, but keeping them both. So we see an assimilation, a sort of or peaceful aspect. But what Rome was really good at, among other areas, but what they were really good at was trying to get everything organized. Discipline was important. Order was important. Now, toward the end of the empire, it starts falling apart, but for the most part, order was important. Rule, recognizing who was in charge, having a head, and then following a structure, very distinct structure. That's part of that militaristic background that they had. And those became really important aspects. So that's how they structured everything. That pater system with the patrons, where a member of the patricians would take in a plebeian as not a slave, but as he would be the mentor or sponsor of that plebeian, that lower class citizen who may be a merchant, who might have been a craftsman of some sort, a field hand, who were necessary. They needed them. So the patron would sponsor that person. So if that individual ever had issues, like legal issues, he could go to his patron, his pater, and get help, relief in that way. Well, they wanted that kind of system. They enjoyed having a structure to it. Now, the Greeks, of course, didn't quite have that same sort of structure, right? They had a noble class, an upper class, and you had the lower class. You didn't really have a patrician system set up. You did have a group of rulers. They did have a government set up. Athens follows that. For the most part, when we think about Greek democracy, we're thinking really only of Athens. Many of the other cities never adopted any sort of democratic structure. That was a part of it. The Romans don't go with democracy so much as what we call republic. Hence why the early years, about 500 to about that first century, so over 400 years, sometimes it'll be estimated a little longer than that, it was a republic where you had representative government, leaders of the patrons. They would meet, they would make the rules. The plebeians, who got a little upset about some of the rules, eventually had their own council. After a couple hundred years, it was eventually decided that, yes, the rules the plebeians make would be used upon approval by the patrons as well. But you had rules being put in place, laws that would be followed. And every citizen of Rome, regardless of where you were, you didn't have to be born in the city of Rome itself, had access to those laws. That meant that if you were in Asia Minor, but you were a Roman citizen, if something happened, you couldn't, if you did not find justice you felt in your own court, in your own area, you could appeal all the way to Rome and be taken before the adjudications there in Rome. That's what happens with Paul. Those of you who are familiar with the Bible and Romans, actually Book of Acts and on through Book of Acts, that's what Paul does. He was a Roman citizen, born though in the Middle East. He was born in Jerusalem area, but he was of Tarsus, is where he's from originally. But his parents were Roman citizens. They were Jewish, but they were Roman citizens. And so he was a Roman citizen, and when he was imprisoned, he appealed all the way to Rome and had to be brought to Rome for trial. Well, any Roman citizen had the right to do that. Even women had the right to legal representation coverage. They could control their own property. Under Augustus, his wife Livia was really a strong proponent of women's rights, I guess you could say. Women had the right to maintain their property, whether they were single or married, because typically what would have happened when they married, man got property. The woman had a right to legal recourse. A little different from some of the other cultures we've talked about. We talked about Hammurabi's code, of course, and we said the women had some recourse, but not that much. They were considered to be secondary to their husbands. Well, in Rome, yes, the man was the head of the household, but the woman was still a Roman citizen. She couldn't vote, but she had practically every other right. A little different from some of the other cultures that we saw. When the break comes, though, of course, what we see is the collapsing of the Roman Empire. We'll talk more about that with chapter 4 as religion comes along. But we see a break in it. It starts changing. They redo quite a number of the structures. The church becomes much more important and becomes very influential in the government. That's not until 440s CE or so. What we do know is that Rome was very good at adapting, modifying. If they found something good, they would take it, and then they would use it, and they would modify it to make it even better. That's how the ark came along. In your book, it mentions about the Etruscans. It talks about the ark and how they were able to use the ark in part of their building in their architecture. This is on page 93. You have this idea about the ark that is used, and they start developing even further. You'll see the rounded ark with a keystone. They probably got that from the Etruscans, but then they started utilizing and developing even further. You'll see the different kinds of archways that they are able to come up with. This is where they got from the Etruscans, as it says in your book, again on 93. The ark was known in cultures, the Mesopotamians, the Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Etruscans. The Romans perfected it, borrowing its principle from the Etruscans, but developing those principles further, so that you wind up with, and you had the picture of the Pont de Garde, that aqueduct. It makes use of archways, so it can support great weights. 8 to 12,000 gallons of water a day flowing through that is a great weight. Well, they were able to adjust that to their benefits, and that's what they did. They took from other cultures. They didn't hesitate to do that. I believe we talked a little bit about in chapter 2 when we saw some of the statues, the Greek statues. Talked about where actually the little blurb says a Roman copy of the Greek bronze statue. Well, that's what they did. They tended to take the statues and then copy them and use them in different ways. What they also did, though, which was a little different from Greek statuary and art, the Greeks tended to make their statues of their gods. I think I showed you a couple of pictures that I took at the museum there in Athens, and there was one of Aphrodite with Pan and the Eros, the god of love, her son, there with him. Well, they tend to make them of their gods. That's what they tend to do. Occasionally there will be some other individuals. For the most part, they're about major figures that they would know. The artwork in Rome starts taking a little bit of a turn. Rather than making art to depict their gods all the time, they started depicting themselves. Some of it was from the emperors. As they took over, they would have images of themselves. Augustus, for instance, we talked a little bit about this last time, the frieze, that's on page 89 in your book. That's Augustus and his family that he had carved and it was placed up so everybody coming back to see that. That was his family. Other emperors started having statues of themselves so they could see that. You have the Augustus of Porto, which is where it was found. You have other people, though, start saying, well, I'd like to have it, I really love my grandfather. I'd really like to have something to remember him by. And they would have sculptors do sculpting of family members. And those busts, or the full statues in some cases, would be put into a very revered place of the home so people would see it. You'll see it in your book on page 88. I guess I can use the dot cam over here for that one. On page 88, you see, it's a Roman man. That's nobody special. They're not sure exactly who it is. But this is the image of the painter, it says. A man of gravitas, heavyweight, dignity. And that's what they showed. That's what they started indicating. They want to show people as they were with wrinkles, etc., but representing people that were everyday people, not something special in some way. They would start having painting in their houses. They would hire people to come and paint family pictures. They were out at a picnic. They'd have them paint a picture of the family off in a picnic, in a glade of some sort. I think I also mentioned about, when the first triumvirate came in that first century CE with Pompey and Caesar and Crassus. That Crassus was very, very wealthy. He got into land development, building the houses on the seashores and villas up in the mountains so the wealthy people could have those. Well, not everybody could afford a seaside villa and a mountain, state as well. I know all of you folks probably have those, sure. I'm just here for a few more weeks, and then I'm heading off to my mountain villa, right? Okay, yeah, sure. Well, majority of Romans couldn't afford it either. They would occasionally get a chance to take vacations, just the way we do now. They would take vacations to the seashore for a few days, and then they would come back. Well, to help them to remember the seashore, because or the mountains or wherever, they had paintings in their houses. They would get somebody to come and paint a mural on their wall of such a site. You see on page 91 a landscape that was part of painting from a villa. And then you'll see on page 101 another detail of a wall painting of a villa. And of course, yes, that was at some of the wealthier, these more preserved ones are probably some of the wealthier villas that were available. But even the common people, when they could afford, they would have paintings of landscapes in their homes. We know that primarily because of what was found with Pompeii, not Pompey, but Pompey. Pompey, the general, was P-O-M-P-E-Y. Pompey is P-O-M-P-E-I-I. And Pompey was, of course, destroyed, we'll say, although it really wasn't destroyed, but it was destroyed when Mount Vesuvius erupted, volcano. And what happened with that was it happened so suddenly, without really great deal of warning. It happened so violently and so quickly that the town was covered in lava, magma, ashes, etc. It wasn't until centuries later that the site was excavated and the archaeologists found the carefully preserved city. Homes were preserved. Pottery preserved. Every detail. Houses were preserved. They weren't destroyed except for the part that was subject to burning. But the stone aspect, that meaning the homes were made, well preserved. Even the people were preserved. They found people who had been covered up in stone in what they were doing. Some were still in bed asleep and never knew what happened. Some were out in the streets. Some were in other places, but they found all of those. Some of the findings could be a little grotesque, but for the most part, it was something that they, it gave us a sense of what the world was like at that time. Again, on page 100 in your book, you have an image of the atrium of a house called House of the Silver Wedding. And this particular one shows you how it would look. It was fairly well preserved there, and this was one of the houses that you have. It says the house gets its name from the silver wedding anniversary of King Humbert. That's the year it was excavated, 1893. They supported the archaeological dig, and so they called it after silver anniversary. But because there's no silver in the house itself. But what we do have is that we have that house preserved fairly well. And again, part of that is allowing us to understand what would it have been like on an everyday basis in this place. And we had a chance, you have a chance to look at that in those ways. We know they like gardens, because several of the homes, most of the homes had some sort of garden someplace. So it became, if this was a typical Roman town, probably other Roman towns had this as well, those that fall in disrepair. But we have those, and so you have each of these aspects. You have had the different people who would have come in and out. And you have had the people showing up and looking at things, which is why they decorated the walls, because they wanted places to look nice. We recognize that. They worked with different pigments in different places. Now, the wealthier Romans would have very elaborate homes. They'd get very elaborate. Gardens would be very elaborate. They'd be quite large. But what we do have is that it's a lifestyle we get in by the archaeology findings at Pompeii. We're able to see these were people who had interests and views, and they had cares, concerns, and they cared about their family members. Some of the paintings on the walls are clearly family outings. Some of the busts are not gods or anything to which they would pray. No, it's family members. Very unlike what the Greeks would do. We talked a little bit about Greeks getting statues and paintings, etc. they generally depicted gods in theirs, or heroes of some sort. Well, not everybody had that way. Although the emperors were not above placing themselves in such a position, as if they themselves were almost godlike. And some actually wanted to claim that. You have on page 97 in your book the column of Trajan. He was one of the emperors. Your book calls him the 5 good emperors. He's one of the 5 good ones, because after that you get some who are not so good. But in your book on page 97, it shows you the column of Trajan. It is overall height. You go from the base all the way up. It's 125 feet. That's a big column to raise. And at the top of the column is a statue of Trajan. That is the emperor, because he wanted to be recognized. And so what you have is this large sculpture, and imprinted, carved all the way around it in a spiral all the way up to the top, is a storyline of his great military campaign. Your book says if that were actually pulled off and were able to be laid end to end across, that would go over 625 feet. So he has this long storyline, which of course most people are not going to be able to see, because they're not going to be able to go up 125 feet to see too well. But he had it carved that way so it would retell his great military conquest and what he was able to do, celebrate himself. Well, with the Greeks, you would have seen that probably as raised to one of the gods, right? Well, not in this case. When they built their buildings, some of the buildings are in honor of gods. You have a model of the Forum and the Forum of Trajan, Julius Caesar, on page 95. And they show you a little bit about the Forum of Trajan in that particular one. That's just a modeling, a replication of how it would have looked. And you can see that's a very well-planned city. Watch your video. It's on page 95. You look at your book, but that's what it looks like. It's a very well-planned city. This is a sense of organization to it. You have the different, you can't see this too well, the wording can't be seen on the screen, unfortunately. But like these lines right here, this is to the temple of Venus and Mars. Not the planets, but the gods. Okay? And they put Venus and Mars together for a reason. Again, many of the stories about the gods, the Romans really didn't make up. I told you they were really good at just taking from and copying from other cultures. Well, most of the god stories, the mythology that you think of as Roman, really is Greek. They just changed the names. Changed some of the major characteristics at times. Dionysus, for instance, goes to Bacchus, and Bacchus is quite often, eventually, it's not initially how he's presented, but eventually he's presented more as an older man who is a little heavyweight, a little heavy in his depiction. Whereas previously the Greeks always shown him as being a very strong, upright, good-looking man. Not every single god, no. The most important ones for him. And for Rome, Mars was a very important god. He wasn't that important for the Greeks. Ares was less important. For Rome, because they're military, and Mars is the god of war. The weak qualities that the Greeks had about Ares, he's a bit of a coward and a bully, those change. He becomes much stronger of a military individual. Military strategy for the Greeks had been left with Athena. That's what she did. She was wisdom. She was strategy, planning. Well, the Romans are going to give that to Mars. Mars, if it's going to be god of war, he's going to handle everything about war. So he was actually a much stronger figure for the Romans than the character of Ares was. But they put those two together because in Greek mythology, and therefore Roman mythology, Venus and Mars, Aphrodite and Ares, were lovers. Although Aphrodite, Venus, was married to Mars, Ares' brother, Hephaestus or Vulcan. Even in Roman mythology, Venus was married to Vulcan. But She didn't like him. She liked Aries, so, or Mars. So Venus and Mars were almost always put together like this. Sort of, oh, we all know the lovers. Little temple lovers. You have several of them. Up at the top, what you cannot see, and I can't reach it that far, you have what are called the forums. They're large buildings with columns and hallways, basically, everything around an open foyer, an open arena area, where people could go and walk and talk and meet. And so each of the emperors tried to build one. So you have the Forum of Trajan. So they had one that was built not by Julius Caesar, but was built to honor Julius Caesar. So I think it's listed in your book too. You can see how well planned this city would have been. You can see also the reproduction of the Colosseum. If you look on the other page, though, page 94, you see what the Colosseum looks like today. It's not in. I had somebody ask yesterday, why don't they repair it? Why don't they restore it? I go, well, primarily because it would cost billions of dollars to do so. That was a large structure, and in your book, I think it mentions a little bit about this, about the Colosseum. It says that it stands at the end of the Forum Romanum, the Roman Forum area. All these, the vast building was undertaken by the 5 good emperors. It lasted a long time to get it built. The Colosseum itself, this the details also on page 94, where it says Colosseum. It was 615 feet long, 510 feet wide, 159 feet high. Audiences says 50,000, although they also think it could have held even more, about up maybe 60,000 or so. Entered and exited through 76 vaulted arcades in a matter of a few minutes. It was a huge structure. To try to build one of those again would take billions of dollars. What you have in your book is sort of an overview in the sense of you look out over it. And you have a sort of depicting, you sort of see how it would look. And then you can see on the other page on 95 that those upper part that you see sort of in the back of the picture, you would see this aspect of it. That would have gone all the way around. Not what okay, here we go. Is this it? Hey, I'm trying to see. There's one that, there's a video, I'm trying to make sure I find the right one, that talks about the Colosseum and how it will look. And I'm not sure if this is it or, no, that's not it. This is the one right here. And I'll show you that to you in just a moment. This is a huge structure. That part that you're looking down on in the center, you sort of see the little half oval there to the right side. That's the ground floor of it. But the ground floor was not the end of the Colosseum. The Colosseum actually had a lower level. You can't make that out too well there. But you actually had a lower level to it. You had the high-rising part of it, outer walls, you had all the seats all the way down, and then you had the arena. But underneath the arena, the flooring of it, which was wooden, that was put over it, which is why you don't see that there because the wood rotted. Wooden, and then covered on top of the wood would be they brought in sand. So you had that was the arena floor. But underneath that was there were a number of passageways. There were rooms. There were areas for training. The gladiators had training areas in there. You had rooms where you could literally sleep for a while. But you also had prison cells because you kept some people in there because they didn't want to be there, but they were going to have to go fight anyway. So they were in prison cells. You had areas where you could keep wild animals because you bring in wild animals to fight at times. So you had cage areas underneath there. And then they had actually a crane that would work. Well, actually not so much crane. It was a mechanization so that they could lift up from below because you don't want to have to be the one to try to open up and bring the lions out. They're not just going to go up on their own. You have to be able to raise them up to it, and then you could open up the cage and the lions would come out. So you had an area that would move back, and the cages or other situations would come up, and whoever was in it would be let out, or whatever was in it would be let out. This little video, and for those of you who are watching online, I'm sorry, can't see it too well, but that's just how it is. Ms. Park, could you maybe get the lights off for us, see if this will work a little better? This is a very brief little video that is only about 3.5 minutes. It just shows you how it would have looked, how it looks now, and then how it would have looked if restored. So you can see it. Look, it might help me to put that on. So there is the image of the Colosseum, how it looks currently, similar to the picture. This is the ground view level picture that you had in your book. There's the outer wall. You see some disrepair. You see the archways of how they use the arches. That goes from other cultures and improve them. Again, that outer wall we're done all the way around. This high part we're done all the way around. But over the centuries it's fallen. But this will show you what it would have looked like. Now I did about statues. Golden statues moving outside. Golden, here's how it would have looked. Archway, 76 total statues that would have been in each of those arches. So that wind would blow through it, you would say, all around the is what you would see in the sea level. The upper part here, this shows you how tall it is compared to a modern day apartment building of some sort. So the upper level, as you move up this way, you'll have seen those. Well, they'll show me this close in. That's where it's at the top. Again, try to give you just how small, how dense it is, even today standards. And this is what it looks like today. This matches that picture in your book. Now watch how they start. When you walk in, there's one passageway you walk in through 76 different marked area, up the stairs. When you walk in, this is what you would have seen when it was new. On this side, the emperor and his chosen party. On that side, other nobles would have been. You would have had, again, carved rock seats. You had a roof. That's what you had up here at the top. This would have been, probably they had a wooden roof to cover part of it so that if it did rain, much of the tower would not have been exposed to weather. They also had the rods up there so they could fly banners. Don't think of as flags. So you walk out into it. This is, if you're in the arena, this is what it would have been like for you to look up and see all of this around you. And then here's the area I'm talking about, below. Below that ground floor, you have these levels. There's the pulley system that was used to raise. So they're lower and raise wherever they need to be raised. Lower your cages. And they have the cages on the pulley system too, so nobody had to go out there and actually pull it off. So that's what the Colosseum looks like. Lights again, please. That's what the Colosseum looks like today, but that's what it would have looked like when it was first, was constructed. An immense, overwhelming building, really, when you think about it. This is what they did. They built on a large scale. Now, here's what's interesting. You know, with the Greeks, We talked about the Parthenon. We talked about the building of the Acropolis and all that was there, right? Those are all dedicated to their gods. They built temples for their gods, as somebody asked me earlier. The Colosseum, that's not dedicated to any god. That was built for the people of Rome. That's what the emperor said. This is for people of Rome, a place where we can all go and enjoy. And you literally had enjoyment there in a number of ways. They would go and cheer for people to attack one another. That's a significant change when you consider it, about what is that's going on, their attitudes that they have. Those changes are rather significant. Rome, though, put a great deal of attention on pomp. This idea about display, that was important to them. When you defeated a people, the military would come back to Rome and have a parade. I think I mentioned a little bit last time. Julius Caesar, if you read the play by Shakespeare, that's how it opens, right? It's the celebration of the Lupercal. All the people are in town, and Caesar's coming through. Where Caesar's coming through, and I mentioned this, I believe, last time, he had to go put down an uprising. He's already defeated Pompey. He's now the dictator for life, but Pompey's sons had tried to raise a rebellion in the west, Spain. And Caesar had to go over there and stop it. He did it, had defeated that particular uprising, taken captives, and was coming back into Rome. And what the Romans did when they defeated someone, they took captives. They were going to make them slaves eventually, or subjugate them in some way, or hold them for ransom, whichever way they wanted to do it. They were high enough caste, they could just be, people could ransom them, because they were in for profit. Romans were. So when they brought them back, they literally took a little time to make sure that their soldiers, anybody who was injured or wounded, had a limp, okay, you don't walk through the street. Going back to your house tonight. The rest of them would take their armor, furnish it, polish it all up so it would glow in the sun, get fresh feathers for their helmets, clean up themselves, put on their best clothes, essentially, and they would walk through the streets with the trumpets blaring and banners held high, and the slaves, the conquered people, would be brought through the streets. For all the Romans to say, look how great our guys are, and ooh, boo, boo, boo. And they would throw things at the conquered people, who would not be allowed to put on their nicest clothes, who would not be given a bath and anything else, or even necessarily anything to eat for it. They just wanted to see just how low they are compared to what we're like. That's what the Romans would do. So when Caesar defeats the forces in the west and brings back the captives, he does the same thing. However, that caused some of the irritation for Caesar with the senators. Many of those, in fact, majority of those they was parading through the streets were fellow Romans. They had been supporting Pompey's sons. So they were Romans too, not some barbaric group. They were Romans. In fact, they may have been relatives, close friends of some of these patricians who were there on the streets. Now, the plebeians are cheering for everybody. Yeah, they're great. They think it's great. Look at what Rome does. They were throwing things at the other people. But this is different. And that irritates the senators, which prompted them to question Caesar and want to get rid of him, and eventually do they assassinate, which caused another civil war, which led to the rise of Octavian, eventually named Augustus Caesar, and the end of the Republic and the start of the Empire. So Rome was into pomp. They liked display. They built on grandiose scales. That aqueduct that you have in your book, and I show you that part there, and it actually goes on for miles and miles and miles, because it's taking water from a freshwater source and bringing it down into the city of need. That's what it does. Their aqueducts did that. They built roads that went for miles, grand roads, so travel was easy from city to city. The expression, all roads lead to Rome, was not really a lie, because they used Rome as a hub for all the roads going out. It was the center of their world. And everything that went out was all about Rome. And that shows you how different it is from the Greek, because you have Athens, or you have Thebes, or you have Colossus, or you have the different cities, and they had their own aspects, their own details. A Greek culture, yes, but limited in the overall spreading of it. Rome didn't do that. They spread their views to everybody and made you have to go with it. And if you didn't follow their rules, they weren't too nice to you. They did not hesitate to punish in public anybody they saw as potentially damaging to Rome. Their literature, Roman literature, I'd say, is quite often a mimicking of Greek. Many of the stories it mentions in your book about Ovid and his Metamorphoses. Basically, it's just a retelling of Greek myths with the Roman god names. But he also wrote another book called The Art of Love, and that got him in trouble, because he talked about all the ways that a young man could seduce a woman. And he also gave advice about where men could go to pick up women. Yeah, that's what The Art of Love is all about. All sorts of little stories and poems. Got him in trouble with Augustus, because remember, Augustus was a family man. He wanted the family to be important. He wanted everybody to have a family. Did we go over this with you guys yet? About if you were 20 to 50, you had to marry? Yeah, okay, I thought so. Ms. Brooks is still waiting. She starts 20 soon. Hey, she's waiting, right? Okay. As soon as we get one of these guys to turn 20 or so, we'll let you know. Okay. But this is a situation that they face. So Augustus kicked out Ovid. I think I may have told you that too. But this is what Rome was like. It was organized discipline until later. And the discipline started waning. And you started getting emperors who weren't as militarily organized. And Trajan was a warrior. He was a military leader himself as emperor. And Trajan column shows him as a military leader. But later emperors were not. 1st, 2nd century CE or AD, they start fading from that. They didn't fight. They had other people do it for them. And the nobles started getting other people to do everything for them. And you wind up having, they were doing very well materially, but they weren't doing too well with their ethical positions. They started compromising. Nero, everybody knows about Nero. The story is he fiddled on Rome burned. He really didn't fiddle. Okay. But he didn't let it concern himself. Word reached him that Rome was burning, that parts of it were burning. He was having a party at the time, so he said, "Oh, it'll be okay. We'll be fine. Let's finish the party first." He had a number of other issues as well. And eventually to the point where they were trying to poison him. They want to get rid of him that much. He survived that a couple of times. So you started having infighting. So that literally Rome fell from within, not from outside, so much. And that brings about what we'll see in chapter 4, how the Catholic Church suddenly takes the place of the emperors. And it becomes what everyone previously looked to the Senate, to the Republic, to the Emperor, looking to those for help and hope and turn to your patron. But now you're told, go to the church. So when we get to chapter 4, we'll talk about that. As we move on, though, we have other areas, and part of it, what we're going to talk about now, is about China. Because while all this that we've talked about so far has been mostly about from the Middle East over, we talked about Mesopotamia, then we went to Greece, and now we're in Rome. We've gone over to the West. Much of this is about Western civilization, of course. There's a world going on to the east that nobody talked about, that nobody considered, that many weren't even aware what was taking place. Now, Rome did find out about China, because that trade that they were doing, the Greeks found out there was someplace over there we could trade with. They didn't go there, but they traded. They had stuff brought to them from that area, and then they just made bargains with it. Well, Rome actually thought, well, all this stuff that we like is from over there. Why don't we just go take it from them? And so, of course, Rome military. So they went over there to fight. That's in a legion, large group of soldiers. They didn't realize how many people they were going to run into. Rome just doesn't talk about that anymore. They eventually sort of wiped that out of the books. They said, don't write that down anymore, because they lost badly. talking badly. The legion did not survive. It was, many of them were captive, which that goes against Rome too. You're not supposed to, if you're a Roman soldier, you're not supposed to be caught. You're supposed to not give yourself up to capture. Or rather, you're supposed to fall on your sword. You're supposed to kill yourself. That's an honorable way for a Roman to die. Not the hands of an enemy, unless it really is in battle, but if you're going to be captured, they want you to kill yourself. That's how you're supposed to do it. Well, this legion, they didn't get a chance to do that. They were caught. And quite a number of them, a few hundred, were brought back into areas. Well, eventually their military skills, they were recognized for being good warriors. The Chinese could appreciate good warriors, so they gave them their own little area. Say, here, we need you to fight with us and also teach us some of your fighting techniques, because we don't know how to do that. And so this area became known as Legion in China because of the legion. And the Romans intermarried with the natives, the indigenous people, Chinese. So you wind up having some people in China who can trace their heritage back actually to Rome. But China is going on its own path. And we don't give enough credit to China for what it was. China was a country that was vast. Much of, though, the ruling areas are off to the east. The cities are there. And what you wind up with, though, is a culture that 1500, 2000 BCE has already organized themselves really well. Where they're having a culture where all this is taken care of in the sense of how it's going to be set up. And it stays that way for quite some time. In your book, they talk about the different dynasties. You have the Shang dynasty, S-H-A-N-G. They dated in your book around 1700 or so, BCE. Well, they come in, they start organized, they start sponsoring literature, they start with building projects, all sorts of cultural aspects from that time on. Well, the Minoan culture we date around 2000, 1500 BC. So the Shang dynasty is going on at that time. They're not, they just didn't spring up. You'd already had people in China organizing, building, trying to create. And the Shang just sort of comes in and organizes it. And they arise as it says here, King Tang established it, where it links the collection of villages across the Yellow River. And you have a noble family, a royal family, that they say were speaking with the gods, basically. So you have them. Well, that's contemporaneous with anything you find in Greece. It goes back well before Rome. In 1700, the people we thought of as Rome probably really didn't even necessarily exist. If they did, they were these little people dwelling in just some river bottoms and not building much. It's going to be another 1,000 years before you start seeing people emerging as Rome. And you already have the Chinese dynasties in place. It stays that way for quite some time until you get to early in the CE or AD era, and that's when the Han Dynasty gets replaced, and it sort of ends at that time. But we have the eventual collapse of that, and the rise of other controlling figures. But your book only goes up to the Han Dynasty. What we're about to look at is a video, if I have it ready here, about ancient China. It's posted online for the online class. If you're listening to this, you can actually go to it and find it. It's under Chapter 3, so you get a chance to watch that. So we're going to stop the recording here. Just a reminder that you do have, those of you online, Chapter 3 essay and Chapter 3 reading quiz due by this weekend. Some of you also here in the class, remember you have that too. So you can watch all that. All right, so I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you guys for listening, we hope.